clerk please call the roll on the adoption of the resolution as amended?
Councilmember Peterson,
Yes.
Councilmember Sawant,
Yes.
Councilmember Strzok.
Ah, the sound of a resolution being passed by the Seattle City Council. Will there be fewer of these in the future with a new measure considered by the council this week? We're talking about council rules. We're talking about surveillance technology. We're talking about clearing out Woodland Park and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel here, and the views expressed on this program are my own. And I'm joined by David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. David, we're coming off this free transit weekend with the Orca card changing software. Was it time for party hats and dancing on the ferry decks, or what was going on, man?
Well, yeah, I mean, none of the Orca machines were working, so any place that would take Orca cards, you got to ride for free. It was a little loophole that everyone got. Well, I hope everyone got to enjoy. I took advantage via the light rail and a ferry ride that I did not pay for.
Don't let anyone tell you that David doesn't know how to party. That's awesome, man. Thank you for being with me as always, David. Thanks especially to our patrons. If you do listen, folks, for the good of the podcast, please do offer your support. We'd love to send you a Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug. These for our $10 a month supporters, and a special mention on our mug shot of the week. And this week it's Liz sending in what looks like a mug full of rain. Well, no kidding, Liz. One of the wettest months of May Seattle has ever had on record. Stay dry if you can out there. Thanks, Liz, for sending that in and for supporting the show. It's pledge drive time here, folks. Please do your part and support the show on Patreon. And hey, we're on Converge Media, too. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. Let's get her going with right here, right now. Well, an update on a story we discussed a few weeks ago, the Seattle City Council changing some of its rules as to how it operates. So they're going to approve the consent agenda process, bundling together administrative items into one vote to keep things moving. They're also going to move public comment to the time after presentations, which should be interesting, so not at the top of the meeting. But this bigger issue we've discussed, David, in weeks past, the idea of abstaining on resolution votes. This brought forward by Councilmember Peterson here. His point, there are some resolutions brought up by council that are not materially related to city government, such as solidarity with farmers in India or a call for de-escalation of hostilities in Iran, which the council has considered in the past. But I feel like this is going to be more than a check-done vote for the council this week, because even the staff memo on this points out, if the goal is to allow council members to abstain, well, this new rule could achieve that goal. But trying to simplify when a council member can abstain, that could lead to even more debate on the council, I'm seeing, and maybe even more time taken up on these resolutions. Do you see where I'm going with that? This whole battle over, yes, this is materially related to the city government or not? Your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's a good point that I think a lot of this is, we always hear some complaints about why is the Seattle City Council spending time on certain issues when it should be, focusing on homelessness, and this question around how well they're using their time. So you're right. It is ironic that they are using up a lot of time or could be using up a lot of time debating this change. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I think I know this isn't the same, but I was just thinking about in the King County Council how Reagan Dunn is now under a lot more of a microscope. He's King County Council member, but he's running as a Republican on the east side, trying to beat Kim Schreier, and the King County Council had this resolution supporting abortion rights, and he voted no, which will have a kind of material impact. So I thought that was just more of an aside of like,
no, it's an important point.
There are times when some of these resolutions are used to kind of put people on the record on certain things. We don't generally, they tend to be unanimous in the Seattle City Council, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting example of a time when these resolutions that a lot of people dismiss as kind of meaningless virtue signaling or whatever could actually have some material impacts in the real world. And in Reagan Dunn's case, now Kim Schreier has kind of a talking point against him that she didn't have before.
Yeah, certainly an interesting political piece there. And I know your colleague Danny Westneat has written about that in the Times, and I suggest people read that one. Very interesting story about Reagan Dunn. But taking this a little bit further, David, so Councilmember Peterson has added an amendment to this that the council staff says could allow abstentions on up to 60% of the resolutions that come the council's way, a number far above the 19% estimated a few weeks ago. And one example of a resolution, just to dive a little deeper here, that Councilmember Peterson says council members could abstain from voting on, a resolution supporting Seattle school district levies. Now, it's a separate government agency, separate budget. All these levies pass all the time. I get it. But if you're trying to make this case that the future budget of the school district has no material bearing on city government, that's where this argument about abstentions gets a little weird for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and I don't have a great answer for how
Yeah.
they kind of decide what's relevant to city government and what's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably one of those things where it seemed like maybe it would be kind of an easy thing to do at first, and has since gotten a lot more complicated.
Yeah, I know. As it turns out, council staffs look into this a little bit, and this is not a common practice around the state. Local governments usually only allow abstentions for a conflict of interest. So I thank you for the deep dive on this one, David. And we're going to get even wonkier, if you can believe that, on our next issue here, folks. We're going to be talking about what's happening with the council in approving Seattle Police Department's surveillance impact report this week for its use of specialized audio surveillance technology. So let the wonkiness commence here. So, David, I found this important because I remember covering a story almost 10 years ago, 2013, when the SPD got a federal grant to install surveillance cameras, and they did along the shores of Alki Beach in West Seattle, out in Ballard, too. But the ACLU said, hold up, what are you doing with these cameras? A lot of questions around this. It actually led to several years of debate, but an ordinance finally passed in 2017 that said, okay, SPD, you need council approval to use this kind of technology to avoid these invasion of privacy issues. So the SPD's put together the surveillance impact report, folks, for some of its audio recording technology. And city staff has come back and said, there's not much to this report. No metrics have been set up to see how this is impacting different ethnic groups. There's only boilerplate language on how it would mitigate invasions of privacy, and no information on how the SPD could verify the authenticity of its recording. David, a lot of background here, but I think this is big. With all the chatter about SPD needing budget, needing officers, it feels like this arguably very important reporting work is kind of falling through the cracks.
It's an interesting point.
Yeah.
And because this is audio recording, I
A lot of
think
issues
maybe,
with that in our state for sure. Yeah.
right. Yeah. But, there's probably, this is speculation, but there's a sense that maybe, this is a practice that I think, police departments, if anyone who's seen The Wire knows, police
Right.
departments have been doing for a long time. And,
Yeah.
there's the warrant process, but, so maybe there's a sense that, they've been doing this forever and sort of wondering why they suddenly need to kind of justify their actions.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You talking about the 2013 debate around this. The timing of that, I think that became a really big deal because it was kind of right in the aftermath of the Snowden disclosures.
Yeah. There you go.
Surveillance and technology and sort of all of that was really under the microscope.
Yeah.
I would say that since then it maybe doesn't quite get as much attention as it used to, but
Right.
It's one of those things where if there are faults in the way that Seattle Police Department is tracking their use of these technologies, maybe it does deserve more attention, and in theory that's what this ordinance is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and interesting. At that time, Bruce Harrell was the head of the technology committee for the
Right.
city. So there's a lot of different overlays here, but maybe we can dive just a little bit further into police issues here, David, because we're talking about a situation here with the council wanting to do some hiring bonuses. We touched on this last week. A truce, I guess, reached between Councilmember Herbold and Nelson last week with some intervention by the mayor here. So Councilmember Herbold got what she wanted. $650,000 to hire a recruiter and pay for relocation expenses for officers. Nelson wanted a whole lot more, but she got $350,000 more for recruitment, outreach, and advertising here. So a bit of a détente between those two council members on this one with the help of the mayor here. What impact do you think this is going to have, these different measures here, talking about hiring bonuses, et cetera, for the SPD?
I don't know. As we've talked about a bunch of times, and I was just reading a little bit more. I mean, most big departments across the state now seem like they have some form of a hiring bonus. So in some ways, I don't know whether this will actually serve to increase the number of officers, or if in some ways this is kind of like a bit of an arms race where the Seattle Police Department is just trying to keep up.
Hmm.
So the impact of it will not be felt, I wouldn't think, right away, if there is
Right.
any impact. And the hole that they're trying to dig themselves out of is as we've discussed, quite
It's
deep.
significant. Yeah. Yeah.
So whether a million bucks or whatever it is, in a 300 and some $1 million budgeted police department makes a difference,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see. And I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that even Mayor Harrell, or some of the council members are convinced that it's going to make that much of
Make
a
a dent.
difference. But
Yeah. Yeah.
they ran, both Sarah Nelson and Bruce Harrell ran on growing the police department and doing more
Right.
recruitment. So they've got to try something. It
Yeah.
seems.
Yeah, and some dollars are also going to go into, from what I understand, the effort to do a nationwide search for a police chief too.
Right.
So there's a lot of different pieces moving here. So thanks for breaking those pieces down with me, David. All right, up next, we're going to talk about a sweep of Woodland Park, the homeless encampments there that were unauthorized. The mayor said he was going to do this, and he did. We'll talk about the aftermath of that on Now Hear This. Well, a massive homeless encampment on Woodland Park cleared last week after what the mayor's office says was several months of outreach to get people into shelter. When the cleanup trucks were rolling in last Tuesday, only a handful of people remained. Here's what it sounded like. Well, David, 5 months of outreach at this park, and this looks like the prevailing technique, if you want to call it that, for the city now is this long game, trying to get people into services for a matter of months, but definitely a definitive end date there where we have to clear out of here. Your thoughts on this? Is this working? I know it was tried in Ballard. I know it was tried in the Pioneer Square neighborhood. Your thoughts about what happened at Woodland Park?
Yeah, I think the Woodland Park sweep says a lot of things about the city right now,
Hmm.
which is one. I mean, as you were alluding to, I mean, we've been hearing fights and debates over sweeps and the best way to approach them for a long time,
Years.
and it does seem like the approach that is being taken to Woodland Park is theoretically represents a few different groups of people who maybe used to fight a little bit more, sort of trying to come together on an
Mm.
approach to this, which is this kind of just care lead model that
Yeah.
Andrew Lewis has been touting a lot, and that Mayor Harrell has apparently got behind, which is you kind of focus on these biggest encampments and then really flood the zone with outreach and spend a
Yeah.
long time really working to move these people into housing. In fact,
Hmm.
some of the outreach workers who work on this, kind of resent calling it even a sweep because they don't see it as a sweep. They see it as sort of this wraparound outreach.
Yes.
And
Effort. Yeah.
and it's an approach. It's an approach that I think has more buy-in, at least not full buy-in, of course, but more buy-in than some of the kind of quicker turn sweeps of before. The
Mm.
problem is, it comes up against the reality of missing shelter, which
Hmm.
is there enough, and specifically, is there enough shelter that people want to go to and then want
Yeah.
to stay in?
Right.
So this approach was really touted with, I think it was Ballard,
Hmm.
when there was an encampment sweep there. But at the time, there had been a lot new shelter that had come
Hmm.
online.
Right. Right.
And so there was this fairly clear pipeline from
Hmm.
Ballard to housing.
Right.
It's less clear that that pipeline is as strong with Woodland Park right now. And so,
Right. Right.
um, whether or not this sticks or if it kind of does the same thing that a lot of sweeps in the past have done, which is
Hmm.
scatter people to the wind for a little while
Yeah.
before they regroup somewhere else. I don't know. We'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, and you make a good point that was echoed by our colleague Erica C. Barnett in Publicola. She was talking about this. The mayor's office made 83 offers of shelter or housing to people in the park, but as Publicola pointed out here, 79 of those were for short-term emergency shelter. Only 4 were for permanent supportive housing. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about here. A lot of people going into emergency shelter, which is certainly not as uh, closely monitored in terms of who's coming in, who's leaving, or whatever else, as the permanent supportive housing piece. So I feel like we don't know yet in terms of the actual impact of this sweep and what's going to happen here.
Yeah, I think that's right. As is, I think, fairly well understood in city government at this point. Certainly more so than maybe 2015 or something. Is
Mm.
emergency shelter has its purpose, certainly, but it is not the preferred method because it's uncomfortable for people, and it has a lot of demands. You got to be there at a certain time and be out at a certain time, and you can't bring in pets, partners, or possessions.
Family, yeah.
Restrictions around substance use and things like that. And so,
Sure.
yeah, I mean, it, even, and I think the COVID pandemic too, to a certain extent, really kind of, I think the shelter community, and I know DESC talks a lot about this, is they
Yeah.
were moving in a direction away from these kind of large congregate emergency
Yes.
shelters. They
Right.
really, I think Daniel Malone at one point had told me that, for years they had just told themselves that, inside is better than outside no matter what. But some of these
Sure.
shelters, even DESC was saying, are such that they're not even 100% sure they can say that anymore.
Yeah.
And I think COVID really sped up the shift that was already underway away
Right.
from kind of crowded shelters as being
hmm
unsafe and kind of challenging for people. And so,
hmm
but then of course the problem is what else is there, and there's just not a lot. And so
Right.
I think tiny homes have become more of a talking point because it's sort of in somewhere in between
Right.
emergency shelter and permanent supportive housing, but there's
hmm
not, when you're talking 80 people at a time,
Right.
finding that space for those people is
Not easy. Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
challenging.
Right. And I guess I thought this was important too. I think we may have touched on this a few weeks ago, but this whole idea of, I think there were a number of headlines around Woodland Park over the past several weeks. And I think the interesting dynamic to me, at least, was that ended up attracting more people who said, wow,
Hmm.
it looks like they're focusing here next. It looks like that's going to be my pathway to some sort of housing or whatever else. So talk to me about that piece, because I think that's a really interesting dynamic. At first, Woodland Park had maybe 60 some odd residents. That number ballooned up to 83, something along those lines. So I think we're seeing a response there from people who are homeless trying to reach out for those services. And I don't know quite where they're going to announce the next sweep is going to be, but maybe that's the next place people show up and try to seek this.
Yeah, and I also think it kind of reflects what a lot of most outreach workers will tell you, which is there's not the notion of kind of quote service resistant people
Mm,
is blown out of proportion. They say that almost most people, when you talk to them and offer solid permanent supportive housing with a door that closes, are
hmm
really interested in that.
Yeah.
What people are not interested in are all the things we just talked about
Yeah.
with emergency shelter. And so I think people going to Woodland Park to try and connect with a service, someone who's doing outreach, is probably reflective of the fact that people do want to find kind of more stable permanent housing. Um, but if that's what you're looking for, and then the offer you get is a crowded
Right.
shelter,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
you might say, well, this isn't actually what I was interested in. This is worse than what I was doing before. So now
Right.
I'm gonna bounce. So
Yeah.
um, I think resistance to emergency shelter is certainly not the same thing as resistance to good, solid housing that is
Yeah.
safe and warm.
Excellent, excellent point there. And I think that when these different people who are homeless are trying to access these services and find themselves blunted in some way, yeah, there are only so many rooms out there for people out there, so many spaces out there. And that's going to be an issue for Seattle now and well into the future. But I wanted to talk about another story here, David. Big headlines last week about this. The Duwamish Tribe filing a lawsuit seeking federal recognition that it is indeed a tribe. So this has been a battle for 4+ decades here. And David, the case now rests on this idea that many times the federal government has dealt with the Duwamish as a tribe, so it's time for recognition. This didn't work in 2015, but here they go again, the Duwamish tribe working on this. It's been a long fight. Do you see a potential breakthrough happening here? This is such a complex case.
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't even guess. I mean,
Yeah,
like you said, uh, it's I mean, tribal law is really complicated,
yeah,
and for a lot of reasons, both legally and just you're talking about what who qualifies as a
yeah,
as a tribe. I mean, that's
yeah,
that's a really sensitive subject.
yes.
So no, I don't have any guesses about if this will be any different or not. It's
Right.
certainly interesting, though. I would we'll be following closely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a new Secretary of the Interior, and Deb
Right.
Haaland there, who is the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary. I don't know how that changes the calculus here. And on the flip side of this, I thought this was really interesting, David, in reading about this. There are a number of different tribes around our area, the Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Tulalip, Puyallup, all saying, well, the Duwamish still do exist as members of these enrolled tribes, you know? And
Right.
so it's sort of trying to figure that out on the national level, but on the local level too. This identity is, I don't know. I keep on coming back to the word complex, and I wonder how this plays out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's you're talking about sort of independent questions of independence and sovereignty, and who qualifies for what. I mean, like you
And
said,
who
and then
qualifies for aid too. I mean, that's a
right,
big piece of this, right?
and then yeah, you throw in just like the just incredibly complicated and sensitive subjects around who is considered Native American. How do you
Yeah.
prove that, and how do you
hmm
decide that, and then how do you how is membership in these tribes sort of determined? And
hmm
it's just a really thorny subject that I feel is way above my pay grade.
Yeah, I know. I feel that too in wrestling with this, but
Yeah.
I think it's something that's going to be talked about for many, many weeks to come. An interesting piece to this lawsuit as well. The Duwamish saying the federal government has illegally discriminated against the tribe because it's a matriarchal tribe, and it largely is descended from marriages between Duwamish women and non-Indian men, and the feds are violating the federal equal protection clause under the Fifth Amendment. So I think there are going to be a lot of different legal arguments around here that we're going to have to try to keep an eye on, but something very interesting happening in our area, and I wanted to make sure we talked about it. All right. Well, up next, we are talking about a very interesting story, front page news for the Seattle Times. David Croman talking about aging gas tanks. He's not just telling you about transportation, he's telling you about the gas that's going to keep your car going here. We're going to break it down on Transportation Talk. David, you have been a busy man over the last several weeks, sir. I know you always stay busy, but there's a story you went in depth on when it comes to gas tanks that gas stations use to pump out gas from, et cetera, around our area, and a number of them needing to be decommissioned or taken out of business or whatever else because they're old and they're starting to get past their livable age there. Can you talk to us about this? This was a fascinating story.
Yeah, it's complicated, and it took some kind of finessing to thread the needle on this. But I mean, the
Yeah,
long and short of it is, in the '80s, there was sort of a crisis of leaking gas stations, including some gasoline getting into people's water. And so,
I see. Okay.
in response, the EPA issued all these new regulations, sort of requirements that people swap out or upgrade their fuel storage tanks.
hmm
But that was in the late '80s and early '90s, and we did see that happen. But now here we are 30 years later, and there has not really been any follow-up to those regulations. So
Mm,
that means that the average age of these systems in Washington state is 28 years. So and it's important to note that most people, the warranties on a lot of these tanks expire at 30 years, and it's
I
sort of
see.
viewed by experts that at 30 years you that is when these systems become particularly vulnerable to leaking. And so
Yeah.
some states even require that at 30 years they're swapped out.
Yeah, right, right.
And
Which,
so
if I can jump in here, just real quick, an environmental issue for sure, but a financial issue too. You had a case study of one person in particular who owned an older gas station or whatever else, and now is saying, now what do I do with this thing? Trying to sell it or whatever else seems impossible. Could you dive into that piece too?
yeah, exactly. I mean, like you said, there are kind of two issues here. The
hmm
one is environmental, of course,
hmm
which is we don't want gas leaking into our groundwater. And
Nope.
not to overstate the problem, we're not talking like Flint levels of poisoning or anything
I
like
see.
that, but it does represent an environmental damage, and especially when it hits groundwater. So that
Yeah.
is something we want to prevent.
hmm
But then the other piece to this is the liability for this falls to the gas station owners, and that's not a problem if you're Safeway or Costco, but if you run a gas station which is owned by individuals. It's not
Right.
like Exxon or whatever owns these gas stations. They provide the
Right.
gas, but it's the owners who own these gas stations. And so
hmm
um, a lot of these folks, they're not making a lot of money. Their systems are getting old, so they're leaking. It's really expensive to upgrade these systems, but if they kind of take the time to look to see whether or not the systems need upgrading, and they do, which the chances are they probably do, they have to spend the money to fix it.
Mm.
And so a lot of them are kind of in this position where it's easier to sort of just not check it out,
Mm.
which of course is not good environmentally, but then you can kind of also understand why that is, because they've been running
Right.
these on pretty thin margins for a while. And if it turns out that they have hit groundwater, the cleanup on some of this stuff is in the, it can be $1 million. I mean, it's
Wow.
a lot of money. And there's not always there's not a lot of options out there for them to go and get help with this. So
Mm,
it's this interesting situation where, you can sympathize with the owners of these gas
sure.
stations, that they're on the hook for this stuff. And also there is this sort of weird reverse incentive to look the other way, which of course
Yeah.
has the potential to cause environmental damage around these gas stations. So,
Wow.
um, it's a nationwide problem. It's not
Yeah.
just a Washington state problem, but
Yeah.
Washington has, soggy weather. It's wet weather. So there is a tendency in Washington state to have
I
tanks
see.
that degrade faster than in
Mm,
other parts of the state. And a study a few years ago showed that actually Washington's tanks are among the oldest in the country, at least when compared to kind of a sample size of states.
oh boy. Yeah, we're
Um,
number one. Okay, great. Yeah.
yeah. So, and then the other wrinkle I will add onto this is
Hmm.
Washington is being aggressive in trying to move towards electric vehicles,
A great point.
um,
Yes.
and including phasing out sales of new gas powered vehicles by 2030. So if it's anywhere
Right.
close to successful of that, experts say what follows is the profits on these gas stations would start to go down, and their demand for their properties would start to get down. So then you
Wow.
kind of in the situation where you've got folks who were already not making a lot of money on these things, potentially making less money on these things, and with the age of these systems
Hmm.
being what they are, there's a pretty good chance that a large number of them have contaminated the soil around them. And so it's a
Wow.
situation where you've got environmental problems and then a lot of people without any money to do anything about it.
Wow. This reminds me so much of the unreinforced masonry debate. And it's
Right,
not even a debate, it's an issue in the city of
right.
Seattle. And you look at these older buildings in Chinatown and Pioneer Square, and it's like, oh, I hope that doesn't fall down, which, I mean, big safety issue there as well. But it's trying to figure out the money to do it. And as much as the enforcement makes sense, as you point out there, it's like, well, at the end of the day, the owner doesn't have that money. Does the state have that money? How are we going to actually fix the problem? That's big question there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a tendency to want to put blame on this
Mm,
thing or that thing, but in some ways
right.
that's beside the point.
Mm,
In my view, which is you can blame whoever you want, but the
hmm.
reality is these things exist, and the people who are probably most likely liable for them just don't have the money. So you
Yeah.
can get mad at them for it, but it's not going to fix the problem, which is the
Yeah.
tanks need to be cleaned up eventually. In places like Seattle,
Mhm.
it's frankly probably not going to be as big of an issue
Yeah.
because land is so valuable right now that
Sure.
a private developer is going to be willing to put up $1 million to clean up a gas station
Yeah.
site,
And
almost certainly. But
that's the
the further
truth.
you get out from Seattle,
Mhm.
the less likely a private company is going to want to put up the money to do that, which means
Wow.
you
Yeah.
got a guy like the one I talked to up in kind of rural Whatcom County who
Mhm.
is sitting on this land that it's this old shop. It hasn't been open since 2019. He hasn't served
Yeah.
gas there since 2017, but
Right.
so he's not making any money on it, but he's sitting on the liability of
Yeah.
this potentially $1 million cleanup. And he said, he doesn't even want to pass it to his daughter when he dies.
Right.
He's 80
Yeah.
because he's worried about the liability that's going to go with it.
Whew, man, that's a great story, David. Thank you for pointing that out to us. A great front page story on the Seattle Times. All right, in other important news, David, here as we wrap up, I saw your tweet about getting some duck eggs, liking them better than chicken eggs. Your colleague Louis Cam called you an egg elitist, which was absolutely brilliant. But what is the real story here? Are duck eggs really that much better? What do you got?
Yeah, my friends have ducks, and so they stayed with us over the weekend and brought us
Yeah,
duck eggs. And yes, they're better because the yolk to white ratio is so much better. It's like
interesting.
how it's like 1/3, 2/3 with a chicken, you get like a
Yeah, yeah,
third
yeah.
yolk, and I would say
Uh-huh.
it's like 50/50 yolk
Really?
to white. So it's a whole much way better experience.
Awesome, man. Well, I have to
Yeah.
I'll have to, catch up with you on that. Maybe you'll, get my kids bacon with the duck eggs there. We'll see how it goes. But thank you, David, as always, for helping me out with the show. Thanks to everybody listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is available on all the major platforms. And once again, if you are a listener, please support the show on Patreon. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.